A family can look perfectly fine from the outside and still be quietly falling apart on the inside. The house is still there. Everyone still comes home. Birthdays are still celebrated. Meals are still shared. And photographs are still taken. But something feels different. Conversations become practical instead of personal. People ask, "Did you take care of that?" Or, "What time will you be home?" But slowly stop asking, "How are you really doing?" And that is where a strange kind of loneliness begins. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who are supposed to know you, and realizing they may no longer see you. Emotional distance rarely arrives with a dramatic announcement. There is usually no single moment when everyone decides to stop caring. It happens through smaller moments. A conversation gets interrupted. An apology never comes. Someone tries to explain how they feel and gets dismissed. Someone becomes too busy to listen. Someone else becomes too tired to talk. None of these moments seems large enough to destroy a relationship. But repeated often enough, they create a new emotional normal. And eventually people can become strangers without ever actually leaving the room. Modern life makes this easier to ignore. Work follows people home through screens. Responsibilities create constant pressure. Children and adults are surrounded by notifications, entertainment, deadlines, expectations, and an endless stream of information. Even when everyone is physically present, part of their attention is somewhere else. Family may be sharing the same room, but not necessarily sharing the same experience. And when this happens night after night, emotional connection begins losing the competition against everything else demanding attention. We live in a strange age. Communication has never been easier, yet being understood can still feel difficult. We can send a message in seconds, but a meaningful conversation can feel exhausting. We can share pieces of our lives with hundreds of people, yet hesitate to tell the person sitting beside us what is actually happening inside our mind. Because communication is not the same as connection. Communication moves information from one person to another. Connection requires attention. It requires curiosity. And it requires the willingness to remain present when the conversation becomes uncomfortable. This is where psychology begins to explain what philosophy alone cannot. People do not become emotionally distant for no reason. Often, distance is learned. When honesty repeatedly leads to criticism, people become selective with the truth. When vulnerability is mocked, they become guarded. When every disagreement becomes an argument, silence starts feeling safer than honesty. Eventually, a person may stop sharing, not because they have nothing left to say, but because they have learned that revealing themselves comes with a price. And once withdrawal begins, it can become self-reinforcing. The less one person shares, the less the other person understands. The less they understand, the more assumptions begin to replace conversation. Those assumptions create frustration. Frustration creates more distance. And the person who withdrew in the first place now feels even more justified in staying silent. It becomes a psychological loop. Nobody has to consciously choose it. The pattern simply keeps repeating until emotional distance feels normal. But there is another layer that becomes harder to see. Not every form of emotional distance is simply accidental. Sometimes people discover that emotional behavior can influence other people. A person learns that becoming cold makes someone else chase them. Another learns that guilt makes a family member obey. Someone discovers that withholding approval can make another person work harder for acceptance. These behaviors are not always calculated. Often people repeat patterns they learned long ago. But whether conscious or unconscious, the psychological effect can be remarkably powerful. Guilt is one of the quietest forces inside family relationships. Someone may remind another person of everything they sacrificed. A partner may constantly emphasize how much they have done compared with the other person. The message may never be stated directly, but the implication is clear. After everything I've done for you, how could you disappoint me? When guilt becomes a regular method of influence, love can slowly become obligation, and obligation may produce obedience, but it does not necessarily produce closeness. Another powerful pattern appears when affection becomes conditional. When someone receives warmth only when they behave a certain way, approval becomes something they have to earn. Over time, they stop asking what they genuinely want and start asking what will keep the relationship peaceful. This can happen between partners. It can happen between parents and children, and it can continue long after childhood is over. A person may grow into an adult who still measures their worth through someone else's approval without realizing where the habit began. And then there is silence. Silence can be peaceful, but it can also become pressure. When someone repeatedly withdraws affection, conversation, or attention until another person gives in, silence becomes more than silence. It becomes a behavioral signal. Change what you're doing, and I will come back. This is where emotional distance begins crossing into power dynamics. The question is no longer simply, why aren't we connecting? It becomes, who is changing their behavior to keep the emotional balance of this relationship intact? Every family has a power structure, even when nobody talks about it. Someone usually has more influence over decisions. Someone controls more resources. Someone carries more authority. Someone is more sensitive to conflict, and sometimes someone learns how to use that sensitivity to influence everyone else. Power does not always belong to the person who talks the most. Sometimes the quietest person has the greatest influence because everyone else has already learned to adjust their behavior around them. You can see this power most clearly when people begin walking on eggshells. They monitor someone's mood before speaking. They change their words to avoid a reaction. They postpone difficult conversations. They apologize even when they are not sure what they did wrong. From the outside, the family may appear peaceful. Inside, however, peace is being maintained through fear of conflict. And there is a major difference between genuine peace and the temporary silence created when everyone is afraid to disturb the person with the most emotional influence. Family relationships can also become trapped in a silent scoreboard. Who sacrificed more? Who worked harder? Who called last? Who cared more? One person remembers every sacrifice. Another remembers every disappointment. Everyone keeps their own private record. And eventually, the relationship becomes less about understanding and more about proving who has given enough. But love cannot survive forever as a transaction. The moment affection becomes something people believe they are owed, emotional connection begins to weaken. Consider the child who learns that approval comes only after achievement. Good grades bring affection. Success brings praise. Mistakes bring disappointment. That child may eventually become an adult who is highly accomplished and still emotionally insecure. They may work harder than everyone else, apologize too quickly, and constantly worry about disappointing people. What looks like ambition on the surface may sometimes be an old psychological strategy. If I become valuable enough, perhaps I will finally feel safe. Years later, the same pattern can survive. The child becomes an adult, but the psychological question remains. Are they proud of me? Did I do enough? Will they approve? And now the source of approval may shift from parents to partners, employers, friends, or social media. The person may appear independent while secretly depending on other people's reactions to determine how they feel about themselves. This is one reason emotional patterns inside families can have consequences far beyond the family itself. This is where the Stoic mind enters the conversation. The Stoics asked a brutally simple question: what is actually within your control? Not what you wish you could control. Not what you believe another person should do. What is actually yours? Your judgment, your choices, your behavior, your response. Other people's emotions are not yours to command. Their approval is not yours to possess. Their reactions are not yours to control. And understanding that distinction can completely change the way you experience family conflict. Stoicism does not tell you to stop caring. It teaches you to care without surrendering your judgment. You can love your family deeply and still understand that you cannot force them to understand you. You can offer kindness without demanding gratitude. You can set a boundary without trying to control the other person's reaction. And you can walk away from an unhealthy argument without needing to win it. That is not emotional coldness. It is emotional discipline. Imagine what changes when you stop reacting immediately. Someone says something hurtful, and instead of striking back, you pause. Someone criticizes you, and instead of defending yourself instantly, you listen. Someone tries to pull you into an emotional argument, and you refuse to become more emotional simply because they are. That small space between what happens and how you respond is where self-control lives. And sometimes the most powerful person in a family is not the person who can control everyone else, but the person who no longer needs to. But there is one question that is much harder than asking what our family is doing to us. We have to ask what we are contributing to the relationship. Maybe we withdraw when we feel criticized. Maybe we expect people to read our minds. Maybe we punish disappointment with silence. Maybe we demand appreciation but rarely offer it. Maybe we are so focused on being understood that we have forgotten how to understand someone else. Self-examination is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of being completely innocent, but it also gives us something far more valuable: the ability to change. A family does not become emotionally connected again because everyone suddenly becomes perfect. It begins when someone becomes conscious, someone puts the phone away, someone asks a question instead of making an accusation, someone admits they were wrong, someone establishes a boundary without cruelty, someone decides that they will no longer participate in the same destructive pattern. Change often begins quietly, and sometimes it begins with only one person. But one person's behavior can change the emotional atmosphere of an entire relationship. And that is where the real question begins. If emotional distance was built slowly, can connection be rebuilt just as deliberately? Rebuilding connection begins with something surprisingly simple: presence. Not being in the same room, but actually being there. Put the phone down. Stop preparing your response while the other person is speaking. Look at them long enough to notice when their voice changes. Ask a question you genuinely want answered. These actions sound almost too simple to matter, but relationships are built from repeated moments of attention. When someone feels that you are truly listening, they no longer have to fight so hard to be heard. One of the hardest forms of listening is listening without immediately defending yourself. If your partner says, "I don't feel supported," your first instinct may be to explain everything you have done. If your child says, "You never listen to me," you may immediately remember all the times you tried, but defending yourself too quickly can make the other person feel even more invisible. Sometimes the first response doesn't need to be an explanation. It can simply be, "Tell me more." That sentence creates space where an argument might otherwise begin. But connection does not mean accepting everything. This is where boundaries become important. A boundary is not a punishment, and it is not a threat. It is a clear statement about what you will participate in and what you will not. You can say, "I'm willing to talk about this, but not while we're insulting each other." You can say, "I care about you, but I won't allow guilt to make this decision for me." A healthy boundary protects connection because it prevents resentment from quietly replacing honesty. There is an important distinction here between influence and control. You can influence someone through patience, honesty, example, and consistency, but you cannot control their thoughts, their emotions, or their choices. The moment you try to control another person's internal world, the relationship becomes a struggle for power. And the more you try to force closeness, the more likely the other person is to protect their independence by creating even more distance. One of the hardest lessons is learning to stop chasing approval. If someone is disappointed in you, that does not automatically mean you have done something wrong. If someone becomes angry because you established a reasonable boundary, their anger does not automatically make the boundary wrong. If someone refuses to understand you, you can explain yourself without spending the rest of your life trying to convince them. Your character cannot depend entirely on another person's emotional reaction to you. This becomes especially important when psychological pressure appears. Manipulation often depends on predictable reactions. If guilt always makes you surrender, guilt becomes a lever. If anger always makes you apologize, anger becomes a shortcut. If silence always makes you chase someone, silence becomes a strategy. You don't have to become cold or suspicious of everyone. You simply have to become aware of the pattern. Once you can recognize the emotional trigger, you gain the ability to choose your response instead of automatically giving it. But there is a danger here too. Once people discover the language of manipulation, they can start seeing manipulation everywhere. Not every disagreement is psychological warfare. Not every emotional reaction is calculated. Sometimes people are simply hurt. Sometimes they are tired. Sometimes they communicate badly because they were never taught how to communicate well. The goal is not to become paranoid. The goal is to become perceptive. Dark psychology should help you recognize unhealthy patterns, not convince you that everyone around you is an enemy. Eventually, every emotionally distant family reaches the same choice: continue managing the symptoms or have the conversation underneath the symptoms. Not "why didn't you call me?" but "why do I feel unimportant to you?" Not "why are you always angry?" but "what happens inside you when you feel ignored?" Not "why don't you appreciate me?" but "have I made you feel that your love has to be earned?" These questions are harder because they remove the easy arguments and expose what is actually hurting. And sometimes the most powerful sentence in a family is also the simplest. "I was wrong." Not "I'm sorry you felt that way." Not "I only did it because you made me." Just "I was wrong." A sincere apology does something psychologically that arguments cannot. It lowers the need for defense. It tells the other person that their pain has been recognized. And when apologies stop being weapons and become acts of responsibility, relationships begin to breathe again. Forgiveness, however, does not mean pretending nothing happened. You can forgive someone and still change how you relate to them. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do without allowing the behavior to continue. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. In fact, mature relationships often require both. Without compassion, boundaries become walls. Without boundaries, compassion can become self-abandonment. There will also be people you cannot change. This may be the hardest truth of all. You can explain yourself perfectly and still be misunderstood. You can offer patience and still receive hostility. You can apologize and still not be forgiven. You can love someone deeply and still discover that closeness with them is unhealthy. Stoicism asks us to accept this reality without becoming bitter. Your responsibility is not to control the outcome. Your responsibility is to act according to the person you want to become. A healthy family is not a family that never argues. It is not a family where everyone agrees. It is not a family where nobody gets hurt. Real families are messy. People misunderstand each other. People lose patience. People make mistakes. The difference is what happens afterward. Do they repair? Do they listen? Do they take responsibility? Do they learn? Emotional closeness is not created by avoiding conflict. It is created by knowing that conflict does not have to destroy the relationship. And perhaps this is where responsibility becomes generational. Every family teaches something, whether intentionally or not. Children watch how parents handle anger. They watch how adults apologize. They learn whether love is conditional. They learn whether silence is used as punishment. They learn whether boundaries are respected. And one day, they carry those lessons into relationships of their own. What you normalize inside your home today may become someone else's definition of love tomorrow. Breaking a family pattern does not require blaming the generation before you. It requires becoming conscious of what you inherited. Maybe you inherited emotional silence. Maybe anger was the normal language of conflict. Maybe everyone in your family learned to sacrifice themselves instead of expressing their needs. You may not have chosen those patterns, but once you recognize them, you have a choice about whether to continue them. That is the beginning of psychological freedom. Real emotional strength is quieter than most people think. It is not winning every argument. It is not having the last word. It is not making someone regret hurting you. Sometimes strength is staying calm when you could retaliate. Sometimes it is saying no without hatred. Sometimes it is walking away without creating another wound. And sometimes it is staying in the conversation long enough to understand someone you completely disagree with. So tonight, ask yourself a different question. Not, why doesn't my family understand me? Ask, have I made it easy for them to understand me? Not, why do they always react this way? Ask, what happens in me when they do? And not, how can I make them change? Ask, what part of this situation is actually mine to change? These questions may not solve a relationship overnight, but they can change the direction of the relationship. Emotional closeness is rarely rebuilt through one enormous conversation. It comes back through small moments. A parent who listens for 5 extra minutes. A partner who puts the phone away. A child who finally says what they have been afraid to say. Someone choosing curiosity instead of accusation. Someone offering an apology before being asked. These moments may look insignificant from the outside, but relationships are built from insignificant moments repeated consistently. What feels small today can become the emotional foundation of a family tomorrow. There is one final lesson worth remembering. You cannot force someone to love you differently. You cannot force someone to understand you. You cannot force someone to become emotionally mature. What you can do is become more honest, more disciplined, more aware, and more intentional about the way you participate in the relationship. And sometimes, strangely enough, when you stop trying to control the other person, you create the first real possibility for connection. Your family may not change tomorrow. They may not understand your new boundaries immediately. Some people may even resist when you stop playing the role they were comfortable with. But you do not need their immediate approval to begin changing your own behavior. If you want more honesty, practice honesty. If you want more patience, practice patience. If you want respect, communicate with respect. If you want emotional closeness, become emotionally present. You cannot control the entire family system, but you can change the part of the system that belongs to you. Maybe the real tragedy of modern family life is not that people stopped loving each other. Maybe it is that they became too distracted, too defensive, too exhausted, and sometimes too afraid to show that they still care. Psychology can help us recognize the patterns. Understanding power can help us see the invisible dynamics, and the Stoic mind can remind us where our responsibility actually begins. You cannot control every person you love. You cannot repair every relationship, but you can choose the kind of person you become inside those relationships. And sometimes that choice is enough to change everything, because emotional distance is often built one small moment at a time, and connection can be rebuilt the same way.